Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined. They're real. In Lake County, Florida, there's a stretch of modest homes just off U.S. Highway 27. Lawns trimmed, American flags fluttering on porches, barking dogs behind chain-link fences. Nothing about the cul-de-sac where Michael Shaver lived with his wife and two children would make you think it held a secret, let alone a corpse. Yet that's exactly what was waiting beneath 3 feet of concrete in their backyard. Michael Shaver, 36 years old, Disney monorail technician, was last seen alive in late November 2015. There was no missing persons report, no public appeals, no media alerts. He simply stopped showing up, at work, among friends, on social media. Over time, people drifted away from the question of where he went. But what really should have caught someone's attention was that no one, not one person, had heard his voice since Thanksgiving weekend. His wife said he left, that he wanted to get away. But there were gaps in her version: timing, behavior, details she never volunteered unless someone asked. And when they did, the answers came out colder than expected. Authorities wouldn't learn any of this until 2018. The last verifiable in-person sighting of Michael came from a coworker. A Friday afternoon in November, he'd clocked out of Disney property wearing work boots and a gray polo, said he was heading home. He never came back. No vacation time requested, no contact from his cell. Friends sent messages, some bounced, some didn't. One reply came in 3 days later. "Leave me alone, I need space." It didn't sound like him. Michael, for all his quirks, had never ghosted his life. He loved the structure of routine, the reliability of tools, the daily grind of mechanical work. He had two kids and a gun collection he maintained like a museum. And above all else, he wasn't the type to vanish without his car, wallet, or firearms. But somehow that's exactly what happened, until someone thought to question the silence. In 2018, a friend named Steve finally called the sheriff's office. Steve had known Michael for over a decade. They shared shifts, beers, and late-night texts about cranky train motors. Steve told deputies, "I don't know if he's dead, but I know something's wrong. No way he'd go 6 months without a word." Deputies arrived at the Shaver property in March. The yard was neat, though noticeably altered. A new slab of concrete had been poured directly behind the house. A fire pit built over it. At first glance, it didn't raise alarms. In Florida, backyard remodels aren't unusual. But something was off. No work permit had been filed, and the concrete looked rushed, pitted in places, still slightly uneven. One deputy noted in the field report that the homeowner, Lori Shaver, appeared tense and guarded. She said her husband had left on his own terms, that they'd argued, that he packed a bag and told her he needed space from all of this. She couldn't say where he'd gone, didn't know what state. She admitted they hadn't spoken since. The report listed her demeanor as deflective, not emotional, not panicked. When asked if he might return someday, she responded, "Not likely." It wasn't a lie. The initial welfare check didn't trigger immediate escalation. There were no active warrants, no open case, and, technically, Michael Shaver was a grown adult free to vanish if he wanted. But one note from the deputy stood out. The wife requested we not dig on the property without legal cause. She seemed nervous about the patio area. That line was enough to raise internal flags. Days later, a search warrant was submitted for the premises. It cited growing suspicion and inconsistencies in statements made during follow-up interviews. Particularly strange was Lori's explanation of how Michael continued to pay utilities and file taxes despite being gone. Investigators began combing financials. They found that Michael's bank accounts were still active. Someone had continued to use his debit card at gas stations and grocery stores throughout 2016. His phone had pinged local towers, but most damning of all, his social media had been accessed multiple times from the family's Wi-Fi. That broke open the silence. On March 9, 2018, the Lake County Sheriff's Office returned to the property, this time with excavation gear. The fire pit was dismantled, the concrete jackhammered, and 3 feet below the surface, investigators found what appeared to be human remains wrapped in fabric, surrounded by construction debris. The bones were not fresh. Decomposition was advanced. A forensic anthropologist on site quickly identified signs consistent with an adult male. In the coming days, DNA confirmed what Steve had feared. The remains belonged to Michael Shaver. Autopsy would later determine the cause of death: a single gunshot wound to the back of the head. Execution style. No defensive wounds, no other trauma. What followed wasn't just a homicide investigation, it was the unraveling of 6 years of silence. And the question that hung in every room Lori had lived in since: why didn't anyone look under the concrete sooner? The human body had been found, but in 21st century homicide, that's only half the case. What matters just as much, sometimes more, is the digital footprint a victim leaves behind. And in Michael Shaver's case, someone had been walking in his digital shoes long after he was already dead. Once the remains were confirmed through dental records and DNA testing, the Lake County Sheriff's Office moved quickly to secure a digital warrant. The target: Michael's phone history, email access points, social media logins, and financial activity logs. The aim: establish a digital timeline, prove post-mortem access, and identify who had tried to erase the gap between disappearance and discovery. Investigators recovered Michael's iPhone from the property. It had been tucked inside a small storage bin in the garage, surrounded by miscellaneous electronics. The device was inactive, but the internal memory was intact. Within hours of extraction, technicians recovered fragments of data logs that would become critical to the case. Key finding: the device had not been used by Michael after November 28, 2015. No fingerprints matching his were found on the screen from that date forward. However, multiple text messages were sent from his number in December 2015, January 2016, and even mid-2017. Those texts were short, abrupt, and out of character, especially for a man who normally signed off with emojis and full words. Phrases like "don't worry about me" and "leave me alone" began surfacing in chats with co-workers, friends, and even his own sister. Digital forensic analysis traced the IP address used to send the messages. It didn't bounce off a burner location. It came straight from the Shaver household router. That alone wouldn't prove impersonation. But what came next did. Metadata revealed that Michael's Facebook account was accessed dozens of times in 2016, from a laptop registered to his wife's name. Investigators confirmed this through router logs and device MAC addresses. Even after the account stopped posting publicly, login activity continued. Quiet logins, made in the early morning hours, typically between 3 and 4 a.m. Investigators later noted in the internal timeline: unusual consistency. Patterns suggest concealment over curiosity. Then came a break. In early April 2018, a subpoenaed account from Michael's AT&T profile showed that someone had changed the recovery email tied to his account. That change was made months after he vanished. The new email belonged to a person who shared his last name, but not his blood. Search history on the same device showed queries like: what happens if a missing person isn't reported? How long before someone is declared dead? Does Google track logins to dead person's account? These weren't the searches of someone grieving. These were the actions of someone staging presence. When investigators cross-referenced Michael's bank statements, another digital anomaly emerged. From December 2015 to mid-2016, recurring charges continued: Netflix, electricity, and a landscaping service for the home. But there were also smaller, seemingly personal transactions: takeout orders, gas fill-ups, purchases at department stores, some of which were tracked via store rewards programs and tied to a female profile. In a digital interview summary filed by the state attorney's office, one detective wrote, "We believe Michael's identity was not just stolen, but actively used to stage a timeline that misled friends and family for years. That staging bought the suspect time to control the narrative. The crime scene under the concrete had been silent, but the cloud was noisy. Cloud backups from Michael's old phone captured images taken just days before he vanished. Screenshots of texts, a bank login error, and a photograph of a handwritten note reading, 'We need to talk.' That note was never found in physical form, but it lived in metadata, time-stamped just 3 days before the autopsy said he died. Investigators didn't stop there. They looked at surveillance footage from surrounding businesses near the Shaver home. Most tapes were overwritten, but one clip from a gas station a mile away, dated December 4th, 2015, showed a woman swiping a card tied to Michael's joint bank account, alone, wearing sunglasses at night, no Michael in sight. Each piece on its own wouldn't secure a conviction, but the sum was building toward a clear sequence. A man vanishes without official report. His digital self continues existing. From inside the home he never left. The person benefiting from that illusion shares his address. And 6 years later, his body is found buried behind that house. Detectives began crafting their affidavit. Meanwhile, the public didn't know any of this. Not yet. Michael's discovery hadn't made local news in a significant way. His name wasn't trending. There was no true crime podcast yet lining up to cover it, and maybe that was part of the problem. In towns like Claremont, murders aren't just crimes. They dissolve quietly into routine. People move on. Stories fade, and sometimes the killer counts on that. It wasn't just the digital impersonation that disturbed investigators. It was how long it went undetected. One senior deputy remarked in a closed session, "This wasn't sophisticated cybercrime. It was basic manipulation, and everyone believed it because they wanted to." By April 2018, authorities had a body. They had digital activity that continued after death. Now they turned to what the deceased could no longer claim, but someone else still had access to: his money, property, and identity. The financial investigation began the same week the remains were confirmed to be Michael Shaver's. The goal was clear: follow the money. Investigators worked with the IRS, local bank branches, and Disney's HR department to reconstruct Michael's financial footprint from late 2015 through early 2018. Key account logs from SunTrust Bank showed transactions continuing well beyond the date of his disappearance. Not just automatic payments, but active spending, groceries, gas, utility payments, home improvement purchases. Most of it matched the lifestyle of a person still living in the Shaver household. But the income had stopped in November 2015. No paychecks, no deposits. Only withdrawal after withdrawal. Detectives quickly noted a series of tax filings submitted in Michael's name for both 2016 and 2017. They appeared normal at first glance. Joint returns, electronic signatures, refunds directed to the same checking account he'd used in the past. But a closer look revealed something else. IP addresses for both e-filings traced back to the home's Wi-Fi network. In both years, the refund was spent within weeks. Appliance stores, new flooring, and a used SUV purchased outright under a different last name. That SUV was found parked in the driveway when the property was searched. Investigators obtained copies of credit card statements issued in Michael's name. His main Visa card had been used regularly through early 2017. The purchases were mundane: pharmacy runs, small hardware store receipts, restaurant tabs. But the signatures at checkout didn't match his handwriting. Surveillance footage tied to one of the store locations confirmed what the receipts suggested. Someone else was using his card. A financial crimes analyst wrote in their summary report, "The pattern is not consistent with a surviving spouse managing closed accounts. This is consistent with identity exploitation for economic gain." Social Security Administration records revealed no death had been reported for Michael. This wasn't an oversight. The death was unregistered because the death itself had been concealed. And while this allowed the suspect to continue filing joint taxes, it also created a paper trail that contradicted the idea of a voluntary disappearance. A forensic accountant reviewed household utility bills. The electric bill was paid like clockwork. The water bill showed consistent usage for 4 people. When cross-referenced with the school district, the couple's children remained enrolled without interruption. Life continued in that house. But one person was missing from every document, every phone record, every verifiable login: Michael Shaver. Meanwhile, Disney Human Resources had listed Michael as an inactive employee. Not terminated, not retired, just absent. According to their records, he hadn't officially quit. The resignation had come via email, a short message sent from his personal account, thanking management and stating he was leaving for personal reasons. Investigators compared the message to past emails Michael had written. Different tone, fewer punctuation marks. The spelling was off. Linguistic forensics flagged it as a probable forgery. Detectives added that detail to the warrant application for a deeper forensic dive into all associated devices on the property. Neighbors, when re-interviewed, recalled something odd from early 2016. New furniture arrived. The backyard was landscaped. One said they overheard the homeowner mention, "I had to make some changes to feel like it was my space now." At the time, no one questioned it. From a legal standpoint, these financial patterns created a narrative of continuity. Continuity built on the illusion that Michael was still alive. The bills stayed paid. The kids stayed in school. The life insurance policy remained untouched. But everything else was used, shifted, and absorbed. A financial motive was beginning to take form. Not out of greed, but convenience. Out of the desire to maintain structure, preserve assets, and avoid scrutiny. The forensic team noted that concealment of death had enabled full control of every financial channel tied to Michael's name for over 2 years. Internal notes from the Lake County Sheriff's Office described the situation as sustained post-mortem exploitation. Not a one-time mistake, not panic, a prolonged effort. But questions remained. Why no life insurance claim? Why no divorce filing? Why not simply report him missing and let the legal process resolve itself? Answers would come later. But by this point in the investigation, law enforcement no longer treated the case as a disappearance. This was a homicide inquiry, anchored by a body, supported by digital impersonation, and now reinforced by financial fraud. And it was becoming clear that Michael Shaver didn't just vanish, he was deleted. Deleted from public records, from household explanations, from bills, taxes, and even grocery lists, replaced with a digital and financial presence carefully operated to avoid questions. And for over 2 years it worked. It's often said that people die twice, once when their body ceases, and again when they are forgotten. But in Michael's case, death was denied so thoroughly, even the paper trail tried to argue he was alive, until the truth surfaced under concrete and in code. In most missing persons cases, time works against resolution. But in the Shaver case, time itself became a pattern of small, deliberate choices that, when examined collectively, did not align with the story being told. After Michael's body was recovered in March 2018, detectives returned to the basics: witness interviews, neighborhood canvassing, and behavioral review. This wasn't just about physical evidence anymore. It was about lifestyle inconsistencies, things people noticed but didn't connect, or chose not to. Investigators conducted a second round of interviews with neighbors. One household remembered that, shortly after Thanksgiving 2015, they noticed a sharp drop in noise from the Shaver property. No backyard barbecues, no tool clatter from Michael's garage, which had always been active. Another neighbor mentioned a strong smell in early December, something like burning insulation. They assumed it was yard debris or brush being cleared. But what stood out wasn't what people heard. It was what they didn't. In the months following Michael's disappearance, no one asked about him. Not in the neighborhood, not at school events. And according to records, no family members contacted local law enforcement until the welfare check initiated by Michael's friend Steve in 2018. It wasn't apathy. It was the result of strategic communication, controlled messaging. Detectives retrieved Michael's phone records from November 2015. After a call from work confirming his last shift, there were no outgoing calls or texts from his number. None. But his wife told friends and neighbors that he was texting when he wanted space and needed to be left alone. That gap between her verbal account and the actual digital silence raised flags. The home's internet router logs showed only one user profile logged into Michael's accounts, a laptop owned by Lori Shaver. This had already been established. But the behavioral pattern investigators were interested in wasn't technological, it was practical. During the weeks after Michael was last seen, the backyard underwent renovations. A concrete slab was poured over the location where the body was eventually found. Investigators tracked down a local handyman who delivered a pallet of concrete mix to the house in December 2015. He was never asked to install it. The purchase was paid in cash. When asked during the second interview why the patio was poured without a permit, Lori said it was just something we always planned. But building permits filed with the county showed no such plan existed. This wasn't a home improvement project. It was a concealment effort disguised as routine upkeep. Behavioral inconsistencies extended inside the home. A forensic sweep of the garage found that several of Michael's firearms, previously registered, had been removed from the property. Serial number checks through ATF databases revealed that 3 of them were sold at a gun show in early 2016. The seller used identification that listed Michael's name. Surveillance footage from the event was unavailable due to routine overwriting, but transaction records confirmed the sale. Investigators did a behavioral audit on email activity, credit card notifications, and calendar entries. There were no reminders related to Michael's birthday, his kids' school functions, or insurance renewals. His presence had been wiped from the family's operating system. Everything moved forward as if he no longer existed, but without legal closure. That gray area created space for manipulation. One detail in particular bothered the case analyst. According to the homeowner's statements, Michael had left during an argument and refused to come back. But there was no vehicle missing, no packed bag, and his work boots, muddy and worn, were still in the garage. Investigators noted that in every disappearance with voluntary intent, some form of mobility or escape mechanism is typically present. In this case, there was none. Behavioral forensics is less about catching lies and more about identifying what's missing from a plausible story. And in this case, what was missing was a human reaction. There were no community searches, no online pleas, no effort to report him missing, not from the family, nor from the spouse who continued living in the same house. Michael didn't disappear into the night. He disappeared inside a narrative no one challenged until physical evidence made the silence impossible to maintain. By mid-2018, Lake County investigators had more than a body. They had inconsistencies. And inconsistencies in a homicide case are rarely just mistakes. They're often leverage. The medical examiner's report confirmed the cause of death: a single gunshot wound to the back of the skull, small caliber, clean entry, no hesitation marks, no defensive injuries. The victim was not in motion. He never saw it coming. Autopsy showed he died instantly. The wound pattern excluded suicide. But the explanation offered by the homeowner, Michael's wife, didn't match the evidence. She claimed Michael had become aggressive in late 2015, that he had been physically violent. She mentioned a heated argument. At one point, she implied there was an accident. Then, in a later conversation with investigators, she offered a different version. Their young daughter had fired the weapon, allegedly in defense of her mother. The problem wasn't just the claim, it was the timing. A child of that age, by all developmental and motor skill standards, would not have been able to handle the firearm used. Investigators confirmed this. The weapon type required a deliberate, forceful trigger pull. It was also missing. The gun that killed Michael was never recovered. Detectives conducted a voluntary forensic interview with the daughter, who was now a teenager. With a child psychologist present, the questioning remained procedural. Her statements were vague. She remembered arguments. She remembered her father raising his voice. But she didn't remember holding a gun. She didn't remember a shot. That gap mattered, and so did the chain of possession. According to ATF registration, the murder weapon, our .38 caliber, had been part of Michael's personal collection, one that had never been transferred, gifted, or sold. It wasn't listed in any recovered gun show sale from the previous year. It had simply disappeared, just like Michael. The inconsistencies continued under questioning. When asked why she hadn't reported Michael missing, the homeowner said he told her not to, that he'd warned her never to contact police again, that he was done with everyone. But text logs from his phone didn't reflect that tone, and no neighbor reported hearing a fight the night he supposedly left. Cell tower data further contradicted her claims. His phone never left the area. Its last ping placed it inside the house at 9:41 p.m. on the same night he was last seen alive. The next morning, the device went offline permanently. Detectives cross-referenced this with another timeline: a hardware store receipt showing the purchase of Quickset concrete just 2 days later, paid in cash. This wasn't just a story falling apart. It was a calculated version of events gradually collapsing under its own weight. In homicide investigations, truth tends to stay consistent. Details may fade, but patterns don't shift drastically unless they're rehearsed or invented. And by the time these contradictions surfaced, the narrative being told no longer resembled what the evidence revealed. The truth wasn't just buried in the backyard. It had been edited in pieces, told, revised, and eventually contradicted, until the only thing consistent was that nothing added up. By summer 2018, the physical evidence was solid, the timeline was traceable, and the contradictions in testimony were piling up. But law enforcement needed more than contradiction. They needed intent. And that meant understanding motive, behavior, and the patterns of control that developed in the year leading up to Michael Shaver's death. Digital forensics had already painted a disturbing picture. Michael's phone went silent in late November 2015, but his accounts, social media, bank logins, and tax filings remained active for years. That wasn't incidental. It was deliberate. Now investigators needed to answer why. They began compiling digital behavior profiles, not just logins, but how they were used. A psychological forensic team reviewed metadata related to Michael's Facebook account. From December 2015 to June 2017, there were more than 24 logins from the same IP, each followed by minor activity, liking old posts, updating a privacy setting, removing a tagged photo. These weren't signs of life. They were efforts to keep an illusion intact, and they fit a profile investigators had seen before in domestic concealment homicides. The quiet management of a digital identity to avoid suspicion. A digital forensic analyst noted, each action appears minor in isolation. Together they form a consistent strategy. Avoid raising questions. More telling were the omissions. Michael's birthday passed in 2016 and 2017 without any public acknowledgement. His friends posted messages asking where he'd gone. No replies. The silence created space for his disappearance to normalize. One friend even posted, "Guess Mike went off the grid again." That normalization wasn't an accident. It was sustained absence wrapped in just enough digital noise to keep people from asking more. Investigators also pulled search histories from devices used in the home. One entry stood out, time-stamped December 2015. How long before a body smells? Another came days later. Quick set concrete strength over time. Then, in early 2016, can a missing person still be married? It wasn't just the questions, it was the timing. These searches were made within weeks of Michael's last known contact and prior to the concrete patio being poured in the backyard. Behavioral analysts reviewed medical records and prior incident reports. Contrary to the defense narrative that would later be raised, there were no police reports of domestic abuse from Michael to anyone in the household. No injuries documented, no 911 calls filed, no restraining orders sought. The only complaint on record came from a later partner who told deputies in 2017 that his girlfriend had once said, "I know what it's like to make someone disappear." That statement was not ignored. Motive in cases like this isn't always rage. It's often control, financial control, narrative control, life management without resistance. Michael had been the primary income earner, the one paying the mortgage, maintaining the insurance, and making the plans. When he became inconvenient, the household adapted. Quietly, forensic psychology built out a timeline of passive erasure. It began with isolation, Michael pulling back from friends after reporting tension at home, then silence, then substitution. His identity sustained just enough to prevent questions, while his physical self was erased. At some point, the household stopped waiting for him to return and started living as if he never existed. And the story being told, that he left, that he didn't want to be found, only held up because no one wanted to believe the alternative. By late 2020, the investigation had moved beyond theory. It wasn't just about what happened to Michael Shaver, it was about proving it in court beyond reasonable doubt. The case file was more than 400 pages long by then, and Lake County prosecutors knew that presenting a body under concrete and a digital ghost wasn't enough. They had to show intent, motive, and premeditation. To prepare the charging decision, law enforcement assembled all forensic components into a prosecutorial package. That included the autopsy report, the timeline of digital impersonation, financial records showing prolonged exploitation, and search histories indicating awareness of death and concealment. But prosecutors needed something more, something that gave jurors a clear, logical arc from disappearance to cover-up. They turned to timeline reconstruction. Each forensic timestamp, when Michael's phone went dark, when the bank accounts were accessed, when the concrete was poured, was plotted chronologically. The gaps became as telling as the entries. 3 days after Michael was last seen, a purchase of 10 bags of concrete mix was recorded. Within the same week, his social media was accessed remotely. The household bills were paid, a new router password was created, and Michael was never seen again. This data structure mattered. It replaced guesswork with evidence. Prosecutors didn't have a confession, but they had a pattern, and they were confident it could hold up. In February 2021, an arrest warrant was issued for Lori Shaver. The charges: second-degree murder and accessory to cover-up. She was taken into custody without incident at a property outside Lake County. Her statement upon arrest was brief. She denied wrongdoing and invoked counsel. In custody interviews with friends and associates, investigators gathered additional details. One acquaintance recalled Lori making offhand comments in 2016 about Michael not being part of things anymore. Another said she referred to herself as a widow in a legal document filed the year prior, despite never having reported her husband's death. The prosecution knew the defense would likely lean on one of two strategies: accidental death or self-defense. But neither theory matched the evidence. There were no defensive injuries on Michael's body, no reports of prior domestic incidents that would justify fear of immediate harm, and crucially, no indication that law enforcement had ever been contacted for help. A forensic psychologist confirmed the behavioral profile suggested control, not fear. Jury selection for the trial began in mid-2024. It wasn't a high-profile media spectacle. The story hadn't gone national. But to the prosecution team, that worked in their favor. It meant jurors would walk in without bias, and they could walk out with clarity. One of the final pretrial filings included a motion to introduce the defendant's internet search history into evidence. The court allowed it. Among the terms were, how long before police declare someone dead? Can a wife be arrested for not reporting a missing person? And concrete decomposition rates in Florida humidity. Those weren't the words of someone confused. They were the queries of someone planning. At that point, the trial wasn't just about what happened. It was about who shaped the silence afterward. And with the body, the metadata, and the timeline in place, the silence began to break. On September 25, 2024, after nearly a decade of unanswered questions, Lori Shaver walked into a Lake County courtroom as the defendant in the murder of her husband, Michael Shaver. The case had never been about dramatic confessions or explosive revelations. It was about methodical silence, the kind that held up for years until the evidence beneath it hardened into something even stronger than concrete: truth. The prosecution presented its case with surgical precision. They didn't speculate. They didn't overreach. They relied on digital records, physical timelines, autopsy results, and behavioral data. Prosecutors reconstructed Michael's last known hours, leaving his job at Disney, his final cell tower ping at home, and then digital silence. The next activity on any of his accounts was accessed from a device linked to Lori. They reminded the jury of the concrete slab poured days later, unpermitted, paid in cash. They showed photos of the shallow grave, the fire pit placed neatly on top. The autopsy report spoke clearly. Michael had been shot in the back of the head with a .38 caliber firearm. There were no defensive wounds, no sign of struggle. The jury saw the screenshot of Lori's search query. How long before police declare someone dead? The defense argued what they had to. They claimed abuse. They implied self-defense. They floated the possibility that someone else had been involved. But there were no reports filed, no hospital records, no 911 calls, and no alternate suspects, not even a plausible theory of accident. What the prosecution lacked in drama, they made up for in documentation. They laid out 2 years of impersonation, taxes filed in Michael's name, accounts managed from the shared Wi-Fi, birthday messages left unacknowledged, and receipts of everyday purchases, groceries, car maintenance, dining out, all funded through accounts that should have died when Michael did. Witnesses added weight. Michael's co-worker described how he waited months for Michael to reply before finally contacting police. A friend testified how Lori casually dismissed questions about Michael's absence, saying he just needed to be gone. One juror later remarked, it wasn't the lack of emotion, it was the consistency of evasion. Most trials have a moment that shifts the room. In this one, it came when prosecutors introduced a seemingly minor detail. Lori listed herself as a widow on a legal document in 2016, 2 years before Michael's remains were found. That single entry undermined everything the defense tried to frame as uncertainty or fear. It showed certainty. It showed control. After closing arguments, the jury deliberated for just under 5 hours. On September 29, 2024, Lori Shaver was found guilty of second-degree murder. Sentencing took place weeks later. On November 8, 2024, she was handed a life sentence without the possibility of parole. There were no public tears, no final apologies. When asked if she had anything to say before sentencing, she declined. In her absence, Michael's sister read a short statement. It wasn't theatrical, just direct. We lived for years thinking Michael had walked away. We blamed him. We searched for him in the wrong ways. We thought he had quit on his life. But now we know. He didn't vanish. He was buried. What made this case resonate wasn't its violence. It was the ordinary nature of the cover-up. A fire pit. A few keystrokes. Months of silence. It reminded the courtroom that justice is sometimes delayed not because of what's hidden, but because of how expertly life is made to appear normal. In the end, silence was the most powerful weapon in this case, and that's what stayed with me. As someone who's seen how these stories unfold, let me say this. When someone disappears and all you're left with is excuses and silence, don't ignore your instincts. Speak up, ask again, and don't let comfort override truth. Justice took years in this case, but it came because someone refused to stop asking questions. If this story moved you or made you think, leave a comment. Tell me what stood out most, or even just let me know where you're watching from. And if you didn't like this video, let me know why too. I'm here to learn with you. If you found this video powerful, subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next story. Stay aware, stay connected.